Now that I have enough resolution, I'm going to start sectioning off the model. I've already started breaking it back into polygroups so that I can get around the sculpt a little bit while I'm detailing without having to deal with seeing everything at once. So this will help me while I'm working on figuring out the details in the head. I could even polygroup the mandibles to get around that, but I'm good. Let's hit Shift F, and you can actually work with the model partially hidden and also divided. So in case the model gets too large, the program doesn't have to worry about seeing all of the model at once, which can really help to speed things up when you're working. So I like to isolate the head, and what I'm going to do is, because I'm going to get so much detail out of this sculpt, I'm going to basically be working with the standard and damn standard brushes in order to push this a little further. We're going to be not only refining the forms, but also texture stamping the model using alphas. And alphas are great because they remind me of working with texture stamps with clay. But I'll get to that. So here I'm just going in and I'm refining my details. I'm just making sure that everything makes sense. I don't want to start painting this creature and then realize that, oh, I have no idea how an area of the creature functions. How does it articulate? So I'm really just going in and I'm starting to commit to these areas. Now you can still see areas where the lower resolution was projected onto the high, and so I'm just going to smooth that out and push my details, push my depth. So working now with the model and being able to bounce between the high and low subdivision is really beneficial when it comes to just refining the sculpt. I can adjust the eyes either at high resolution or at low. I'm hitting Shift D and I'm just going to bring it back down a bit. Sometimes it takes a little time. Shift D again. You see? And now I can move sections much more evenly and easily. So you end up with quite a bit of control. If I want this to have more of a point, to taper more evenly, I can adjust it. And this really comes into play when working with posing the creature. You want to be able to pose your creature at a very low subdivision so that you can move everything at a low subdivision, and all that wonderful detail will just follow it. Here I want to push the ear canal. A lot of people don't realize that when it comes to creatures and just real things, there's quite a bit of depth. So I'm going to get this guy ready to paint. Now I'm coming in and I'm enhancing the depth on some of these wrinkles. I'm also going to be working with the texture to average things out a bit. I want to clearly define what's rigid, and maybe things that are rigid have different elements to them. Maybe they have more pits and maybe little spikes at the end of them. You can really get away with a lot if it's genuinely a rigid material. You never know at what angle your piece is going to be best represented. So I try to make sure that I get all the details resolved. At this stage, I probably wouldn't take the model this far if it hadn't already been approved. So right now we're going to say that the concept of the rock grubber went through several iterations. The client approved the rough sketch, and now we are taking our sculpt really far so that we can give him not only some final images of the creature, some orthographic renders, as well as maybe an animated turntable. Well, definitely an animated turntable. Let's really see the depth of this fold of skin. It's amazing how clean your marks can be when the geometry is going in the direction you want it to. Soft concrete. Let's get some cool texture in the face. Definitely want this to read as skin. As you're sculpting, think how you're going to render your creature out, what kind of materials you're going to use to create your renders. And personally, I want something that has quite a bit of specularity to it. And so all of these little pores and all this great little noise that the clay soft concrete brush is giving me is going to really add some interesting specular highlights on our creature. And just like with any other sculpt, I'm adding detail and then softening it. Tends to be the standard for ZBrush. So now that the geometry is clean, I can really take this very far. And some cool details in here. And I tend to jump from overall surface textures to refining wrinkles. At this stage, all of my form is here, and I just have to bring it to life a little bit. Give it some nice noise. And see, with the texture that I'm adding now, skin seems a lot softer. Now, I'll keep working as symmetrically as possible for as long as possible. Then I'm going to turn X off, and I'm only going to be working one side at a time. When I'm doing this, I'm going to add little scars and just tweak the model a bit so that it's not so perfectly symmetrical, and breathe a little bit more life into the character. There we go. That has a nice vulture skin quality to it. I also want to add some deep wrinkles into this nasal cavity here. So this is the part of the sculpt that's actually a lot of fun for me. Working with clay for years, especially like Chavant or water-based clays, this is the part that I always looked forward to. Can be a bit tedious when you get these materials to read. It's going to be a very wet mucous membrane in the nasal cavity, in the mouth. It's amazing how quickly we can detail things out, and this is something that I wouldn't quite do in Dynamesh. I mean, I was doing a little bit of it, but what's wonderful about Dynamesh is that you can experiment with textures and materials for a while and project a little bit of it onto your Z-remeshed model just to test it out. That's looking pretty good. To test, to see how these materials will read, I might add a bit more of a specularity to the material. And in order to do that, we just go right into Materials, Specularity. I think the key's stuck. There we go. Ah, it's too much. There it is. Feels almost like a snake I'm seeing in the face. So this is really helping me to see every little wrinkle in this character. At this point, I also have to start thinking about how I'm going to paint my creature, what kind of color schemes I'm going to choose. I'm starting to think that the top of him might be very dark. I imagine the environment is going to be dark, and I'm going to want him to blend into those rocks that are hiding all of those eggs. So let's play around with some alphas. And again, alpha 58, gotta love it. Lower the intensity. And I want to make sure that the wrinkles are going in the direction in which they fold. You know, how does it ripple through the skin? How does it affect the skin? I just want some nice noise here. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to just soften some of these areas. This is skin. I might add a little bit more mass to the cheek here, which is something I can do with soft concrete. But I want him to be able to move this, these mandibles with ease. So these masseter muscles are just going to get a little bit more bulk. So this part's pretty fun. We can hit Best Preview Render and just see how it works with light. Ah, it's really starting to feel like the rock rubber, just more realized. It'd also be fun to start to add some quills, but we'll worry about that once we get the sculpt a little further along. Let's play around with a few other alphas. It's amazing to see how just playing around with what's at your disposal is really effective. Let's use the dots. Instead of working with a straight line, the dots tend to spray a little bit. You have a little less control with the dots. And this is a great way to show the material becoming more rigid. Feels almost like bone. Same thing here. I'm going to increase the intensity. Now, as I'm working, as I'm dragging this texture down, I have Alt depressed, and so I'm using basically the Z sub. If I were to use it without Alt depressed, then I'm going to get these beautiful little textural elements here, just these dots. And we can just, again, soften that. It's too much. Let's dial that back. Just a few here and there. We can decrease the intensity. There we go. Let's get some nice break up there. Go back to Alpha 58. I really want to get these neck wrinkles. And it's very subtle. So we're going to speed up a bit. I'm going to be talking over the accelerated video here. So again, just pushing the texture using Alpha 58. Here I'm trying to figure out exactly how these rigid plates are going to affect the skin around the head. And texturing is fairly simple. It's just texture on top of texture, smoothed out. It's very similar to something I would do with a water-based clay. I would just carve in my texture and then smooth things out with water. Here I'm making sure that I get all these nooks and crannies in the head here. It's so convenient to hide areas of the model using the lasso tool. So the standard brush is going to be my best friend here. Every now and then you're going to want to add some veins. Again, very easy to do with the standard brush. I really want to focus on pushing the wrinkles and the details, the folds of the skin at this stage. I want to make sure everything in this mouth makes sense. The last thing you want to do is get to a point where you're painting your model and you don't really understand what the materials are doing, how they transition. Adding more texture. You'll notice I check what my model is looking like with the BPR render. I want to see how light hits it. Preview mode is absolutely fine, but BPR, just to see it with at least more realistic lighting really helps. So now I'm going to bring in the Alpha 58 back into the chest, and I'm going to want to go with the skin. I'm going to want to get that texture to move in the direction the anatomy would flow. That's looking pretty good. You notice I had to adjust the intensity. I didn't want to carve too deeply into the model. And as I'm brushing this on, you'll notice I'm going with the muscles, with the forms. You won't find a lot of straight lines here in the texture. It's all curving with the anatomy. A lot of brush work here. It's great to just break up the skin, and you're going to notice that I'm going to be adding quite a bit of texture to this creature. I am basing it off the skin of a vulture, but another reason why I'm going to be enhancing the texture so much is I intend to render the creature in a translucent material. And when rendering anything in a translucent material, you tend to lose depth. And so in the sculpt, if I push the depth, I think we'll have a happy medium once I render it in a material that looks like skin. So again, using standard, and not only will I be texturing, but you'll notice that I'll go in for key areas of the sculpt. I'll be pushing things like dominant wrinkles, tendons in the feet. These are areas that I neglected when I was working in Dynamesh because I couldn't really control it as easily. Look how easy it is for me to pull out these knuckles, to find those rigid forms, to get so much more organization in these toes, defining knuckles. This is all just move brush right now. Really nice edges. And of course, back to detail, working with dam standard, carving in my dominant wrinkles. And of course, having the freedom to jump from high to low resolution is also going to help me control the sculpt. You can see right now I'm adding all of the tendons in the ankle, the ridges in the knee. You always have to ask yourself what's happening in this area, in the area of the anatomy that you're working on. If you're working on an area that has a lot of fat, it's going to be softer. If the bone is right up under the skin, like with the knee or with the ribs, that's going to be a very different way of handling that material, that area, and the anatomy. Um, are we dealing with things that are soft, things that are hard? And all has to read in the sculpt. I love adding these little pits in the masseter, in the mandibles. It really helps to define it as a more rigid bone-like material. At this stage, I'm even adding more anatomy to the upper pinchers here. When I render that, I'm going to have one a little higher than the other. Now, this creature was born, it evolved over years, so we're not going to have too much asymmetry in the character. Yeah, those pits are looking really nice. It's just a wonderful stage. A lot of it comes to life right here. I mean, it's amazing how little you have to do in order to bring these characters, these creatures to life. Just slightly turning the head breathes so much into it. Getting ready for that close-up shot. Again, I can't stress working with those limitations and making the most out of them. Choose your tools carefully. Try to find one that'll get you pretty far and just stick with it for as long as possible. We waste a lot of time hunting around for the right brushes. You'll notice that hiding areas of the model are essential to working quickly. This model is around 11 million right now, and so if you're working in high resolution and things are getting slow, if the program doesn't see the model in its entirety, it's not really worried about it, and so it will speed up quite a bit if parts of the model are hidden. Again, just blanketing these legs in alpha 58. And I'm using it at a low intensity, and I'm working with this alpha. Naturally, Z-add is on, and these lines would raise, but I have Alt depressed, and that's carving everything in. Really nice effect. Just adding texture, smoothing it out again. Layers and layers. So aside from Alpha 57, I'm also using Alpha 07, and that's the alpha that I'm using to get a lot of the dots in the head and throughout the body. That's basically it. I'm not really working with anything else. So it's still moving around, enhancing the anatomy, pushing wrinkles. I really want to get those details in there. Um, Now, a model like this has a lot of different purposes, aside from being able to show the client what the design looks like at all angles. This concept can be used in previs. It can be grown. The model is watertight, and that's pretty useful when working on a film. Even as a video game asset, you could give a client this model. The geometry is fairly clean, but of course, in order to get it into their pipeline, they might end up rebuilding it. But this serves as excellent reference. Same thing if the creature is being created into a visual effect for film. I'm not exactly sure what would have to be done in order to get this on screen. Carving in still quite a few details in the foot using that Alpha 7 to get that bone-like pebble material into the nails. You can see how aggressive Dam Standard is. I'm using Standard here just to get the tendons in the toes going between the knuckles. I love being able to just isolate an area and aggressively detail it, find the anatomy. A lot of what we do in design seems a bit overwhelming, but when you have tools like this that enable you to break down your concept into smaller, manageable pieces, you get through it quite a bit more quickly. Granted, if I was working traditionally, I seriously doubt I would zoom in this far into the design. When working with maquettes, a lot of the details here you wouldn't really need. This is for a concept that could be grown to scale. I've worked on a few projects where my models will be grown and used as a presentation piece, or the model will actually be CNC'd, carved out of a huge block of foam, and then brought into the effects house, molded if they don't actually sculpt on top of the foam. And there are a few options for that. You can carve into the foam, or you can actually add oil clay and resculpt a few areas, refine a few areas, especially if the creature is going to be grown life size. I imagine this guy could be about almost 6 feet tall. So if you had him carved out of foam in a practical effects house, you might want to touch him up with some clay. But that's why I'm going into all of these little details. The more details, the better. Less work for the guys that might have to take this to final. So it's looking pretty good. I've got all of my forms fairly resolved, and it's just detailing. I got all of these spinal plates. I want to make sure they have that Alpha 7 pit quality to them. And just separating materials out. There you go. A few more areas with the Alpha 58. I'm going to hit that. That looks good. Alright, so just about done here. I'm going to do a quick little turntable movie. I'm going to show you guys how to do that. But here is the final rock grubber. Not bad. So this is what I like to turn into clients. I like to show them turntables of the creature. I'll also turn in some orthographic views. But here he is.